Ray Tackett is at his desk at the district office in Whitley City on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, working through the SD card from the monitoring camera he has mounted at the patrol cabin above Pine Creek. He has let the card sit for 9 days. He knows from prior years that most of what is on it will be deer, maybe a black bear circling the cabin, the occasional squirrel, and he keeps meaning to get to it between the grant reports and the timber trespass situation in the northern section of the district. When he finally puts the card in the reader, he starts at the beginning of September and works forward. He reaches October 9th. The frame time-stamped 6:02 in the morning fires during the color window. Just enough ambient pre-dawn light for the sensor to produce a color image rather than infrared. The patrol cabin is in the center of the frame. The slope behind it drops southeast toward a hollow, and the camera covers about 60 feet of that slope before the tree line closes the frame. In the lower right of the image, at a point on the southeast slope that Ray figures is about 85 feet from the lens, there is a thin line rising from the hillside. He zooms to 200% on his laptop screen. The line is not part of the vegetation. It is rising from a single point on the slope, approximately vertical, slightly irregular at the edges, traveling maybe 6 or 7 feet upward before it disperses. He puts his finger on the laptop screen and the line does not move. He opens the 5:02 in the morning frame from the same date. The line is there, slightly thicker. He opens the 7:02 frame. The line is still present, but thinner. By the 8:02 frame, it is gone. Ray sits back and thinks. Then he opens the 2:47 in the morning frame. The spy point's infrared illumination lights the clearing in front of the patrol cabin and the first 40 or 50 feet of slope behind it. Beyond that range, the IR falls off into black. At the far edge of the lit zone, at the point on the southeast slope where the line would rise 3 hours later, there is a form. The infrared image is black and white, the way all no-glow IR trail camera images are. The shape at the slope edge is upright. Ray Tackett has spent 22 years in field work, and he knows what a deer looks like at the edge of IR range, and he knows what a bear looks like, and this is neither of those. The shoulders are level, the form is still. He opens the 6:02 frame. He opens the 2:47 frame. He opens the 6:02 frame again and sets both images side by side on his screen. He looks at the point on the southeast slope in both images. Then he leans back in his chair and looks at the ceiling for a moment before looking at the screen again. Before I get into what I found when I drove out to that hollow in November, go ahead and hit subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single one of those. My name is Ray Tackett. I am 51 years old, and I have been a district ranger with the United States Forest Service for 17 years. The first 7 of those were at a national grassland unit in Oklahoma, working fires and range management and trespass cases, the kind of work that is less about trees and more about land. Since then, I have been assigned to the Stearns Ranger District of Daniel Boone National Forest in McCreary County, Kentucky, which is not a district that gets much attention from outside the region, but is exactly the kind of work I came to the Forest Service to do. Daniel Boone National Forest covers about 700,000 acres across eastern Kentucky, making it the largest national forest in the state. The Stearns District is the southern portion of that, bounded on the south and east by the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area, which is managed by the National Park Service and covers an additional 100,000 acres of the Cumberland Plateau across the Kentucky-Tennessee line. It is coal country and hardwood timber country, and one of the most biodiverse temperate regions in the eastern United States, and the landscape is shaped by those 3 histories in ways that show up in the fieldwork every single day. The coal history is the one that matters for this story, so I want to say something about it. McCreary County sits on the Cumberland Plateau, which is the western escarpment of the Central Appalachian coal field. The coal seams in this county are not the thick, commercially rich seams of the central coal field to the northeast, in Harlan and Letcher counties. They are thin, irregular, high volatile bituminous seams, lower in energy content and commercial value than the thick seams in the central coal field, worked primarily by small operations through the late 1800s and the first decades of the 20th century. The Stearns Coal and Lumber Company, which built the town of Stearns just south of Whitley City and operated until the 1970s, was the large commercial operator. Alongside the Stearns operation, Dozens of smaller, family-worked mines extracted coal from the hillside seams throughout the county. Most of those small operations were never formally permitted. They existed in the way that subsistence, agriculture, and timber cutting existed in rural Kentucky at the time, as part of how families fed themselves and heated their homes, without much documentation. When I started in this district 10 years ago, I knew that history in the abstract. I knew that the landscape I was managing had been worked coal country before the Forest Service arrived. What I did not fully appreciate, until this past year, was what that meant in terms of what is actually present on the ground in the hollows and on the ridges of the district. Shafts, adits, prospect holes, ventilation openings, small structures built to support mine access, all of them old enough to have been absorbed into the forest, overgrown, invisible unless you were looking for them specifically, or unless you happened to walk directly up to one. The district office is a two-story building on North Main Street in Whitley City, which is the county seat of McCreary County, and a small town the way most county seats in this part of the state are small. I drive in from my house on the other side of town most mornings, about 6 minutes. My wife Carol works at the county health department. We have been in Whitley City for 10 years and I expect we will stay. I know this district the way you know a place after a decade of walking its roads and trails and drainage systems in every season. I know which Forest Service roads flood in March and which ones hold all year. I know the timber stand histories and the prescribed burn records and which sections the deer herd tends to winter in. When my staff asks me about a feature in the district, I can usually tell them what is there before they look it up. I did not know the adit was there. That is the thing I keep coming back to. In 10 years in this district, walking those ridges and hollows, I did not know it was there. The patrol cabin above Pine Creek is one of 4 Forest Service utility structures in the Stearns district. It is a single-room concrete block building with a corrugated metal roof, built in 1971. During a period when the district was developing infrastructure for a prescribed burn program that was subsequently defunded before it fully launched. The cabin sits at the end of a half-mile of unimproved access road that branches off Forest Service Road 388, at an elevation of about 1,900 feet on the east face of the ridge above Pine Creek. Inside, there is a cast-iron wood stove with a functional flue, a folding work table, a wall of pegboard for hanging tools, and a landline telephone that has not worked since a storm took out the junction box on the ridge in 2015. The structure is not a camping cabin. It is a utility building, and it serves as a staging point for my trail crew during fall maintenance work and for prescribed burn preparation in the years when we have the staff and weather to run burns. Most seasons, from about November through late March, it sits empty. The slope behind the cabin drops southeast toward a small hollow, and then rises again toward the ridgeline. Between the cabin's southeast corner and the tree line at the hollow edge, there is about 60 feet of clearing before the terrain drops away. That slope is where the smoke was coming from. 2 summers before I found the footage, someone broke into the patrol cabin. They used a pry bar on the door, based on the damage pattern on the frame, and got inside and took a Husqvarna chainsaw that the trail crew had been using that season, a battery-powered orbital saw, and about $400 worth of miscellaneous hand tools. The total replacement value came to a little under $3,000. I filed the incident report. The McCreary County Sheriff's Office sent someone out who took photographs and noted that accessing the cabin required knowing the access road existed, since it is not marked and does not appear on publicly available maps. No suspects were developed. No equipment was recovered. I submitted a budget request for a monitoring camera the following spring, and it was approved for 1 unit. I chose the Spy Point Force 20, which I had worked with before in wildlife monitoring contexts and considered reliable. The camera runs on 8 AA batteries or an external 12-volt power source, has a 20-megapixel sensor, and uses no-glow black infrared LEDs for nighttime imaging that are invisible to both animals and people because they operate entirely outside the visible light spectrum. The trigger speed is less than 1/10 of a second. I set it to record both a time-lapse image once every hour and to motion trigger on the infrared sensor for overnight hours. The infrared range is listed at about 90 feet in optimal conditions, which in practice in wooded terrain with uneven light means somewhat less than that. But 90 feet covered what I needed to cover. I drove up on September 3rd of last year and mounted the camera on a locust post at the edge of the clearing, at 6 feet off the ground, aimed at the cabin door and the slope behind it. I cable locked it to the post, checked the angle with the manufacturer's phone app, and drove back to Whitley City. The card holds about 60 days of footage on the time-lapse setting I used. When I finally reviewed the September footage in late October, it was what I expected. A black bear worked the perimeter of the cabin on the evening of September 11th, spent about 8 minutes testing the door, and gave up. White-tailed deer in the clearing on multiple evenings. A wild turkey flock on September 22nd, crossing from the north and heading toward the hollow below. My trail crew on 3 separate work visits. Routine. The October thumbnails were sparser. The crew had done their last work run on October 4th. After that, the frames were mostly empty, clearing and changing light, and occasional wildlife. I worked through them chronologically, the way I always do, until I reached October 9th and the 6:02 in the morning frame. I have described that image already. The thin line rising from the southeast slope, approximately vertical, irregular at the edges, 6 or 7 feet before it dispersed. I have also described what I did with that image, which was zoom in, check surrounding frames, and pull the 2:47 in the morning frame from the same date. What I have not described is what I did after I sat with those 2 images side by side for a few minutes. I went back through the earlier October frames and looked at that section of slope in every frame from October 1st through October 8th. The slope was slope. Trees, ferns, uneven ground. In no prior frame was there anything at that point on the hillside that differed from the background terrain. Whatever produced the column on October 9th had not produced it before that date, at least not in any frame I could find. Then I checked the frames from October 10th through October 16th. Nothing. The column did not reappear. A single night event, producing approximately 3 hours of visible output, and then nothing before and nothing after. I thought about what natural processes produce a visible gas or vapor column from a single fixed point on a forested hillside in the middle of the night. Geothermal activity is the obvious candidate. Hot springs produce steam columns. Hydrothermal vents in volcanic terrain produce consistent vapor emission that can look like smoke from a distance. But McCreary County sits on Ordovician sedimentary basement, overlaid by Mississippian and Pennsylvanian limestone, shale, and coal-bearing rock. There is no geothermal activity in this region. The basement geology that produces hot springs and hydrothermal activity does not exist here. I know this because I have worked in the district for 10 years, and because it is the kind of thing that would be extremely well known if it were present. Decomposing organic material is another option. Large accumulations of wood chips, compost, or organic debris can generate enough internal heat through microbial activity to produce steam as the material breaks down and the warm moisture rises into cold air. The process is real and well documented in agricultural and waste management contexts. But it produces a diffuse misting from a broad surface area, not a narrow column from a fixed point, and it requires a substantial mass of actively decomposing material that would be visible from any distance and would also show up in every frame over an extended period as the mass slowly oxidized. The slope in my footage showed no surface disturbance, no mounding of material, nothing. Coal seam fires. I thought about those too, because I work in coal country, and I know they happen. An underground coal seam fire produces smoke that vents through cracks and fissures in the overlying rock and soil, and from the surface, those venting points can look like smoke or steam rising from the ground. The most famous example is the Centralia, Pennsylvania fire, which has been burning continuously since 1962. Smaller seam fires exist across the Appalachian coal region, including in Kentucky, but a coal seam fire, once established, does not produce emissions for 3 hours and then stop. It produces continuous emissions as long as it burns, and it burns for years or decades, and it produces enough surface heat to kill vegetation over the vent points. The vegetation on the slope in October 9th's footage was the same as in every prior frame, green and intact. Whatever produced the column on October 9th had a start time and a stop time. It had burned for approximately 3 hours, from around 2 in the morning until around 5 in the morning, and then it had stopped. I looked at the 247 frame again. The form on the slope was at the edge of the camera's infrared illumination range, which is why the image quality was poor. The way any infrared camera image degrades as you approach the limit of the illumination, and the sensor starts receiving ambient thermal return rather than reflected light. At that distance, and in those conditions, the image was soft, but the shape was clear enough. The form was upright with level shoulders, the head silhouette sitting at a height and angle consistent with a person standing still. Bears rear up on their hind legs with a particular forward lean and a profile that is distinctive at any distance. This was not that shape. The form was in the frame at 247 and gone in the 347 time-lapse frame that followed. Between 247 and 347, the form disappeared. Between 347 and 502, the smoke column appeared. I thought about that sequence for a while. Then I started working on my abandoned mine land records. The Forest Service maintains GIS data for known mine features in every district, but the records are incomplete in eastern Kentucky in a specific and well-understood way. Coal mining in this region was so pervasive from the 1880s through the mid-20th century, and so much of it was conducted by small operators without formal permitting, that the documented record captures only a fraction of the actual mine features present on the landscape. The Kentucky Division of Mine Reclamation and Enforcement has an abandoned mine land database, but it focuses on features with documented safety hazards, not on the complete inventory of old adits and prospect holes and drift mines that are scattered across the ridges and hollows of a coal county like McCreary. Small drift mines, the kind worked by a family or a two-man partnership in the 1910s and 1920s, were typically horizontal adits driven into a hillside to access a thin coal seam. They were often worked for a few seasons and then abandoned when the seam pinched out or became unprofitable. When the Forest Service acquired land in eastern Kentucky in the 1930s and 40s, the acquisition documents cataloged farmhouses, outbuildings, fencing, and cultivated land. Small mine adits were frequently not mentioned, either because they had already been abandoned for decades or because the surveyors did not consider them significant improvements. I pulled the GIS layer for the parcel and looked at the terrain around the patrol cabin. No mapped mine features on the southeast slope. No features within 300 feet of the coordinate I had marked for the smoke column's origin point. The coordinate was an approximation, accurate to about 30 feet based on the frame geometry and the known camera position, but 30 feet was close enough. I drove out to the hollow on November 7th. I parked at the Forest Service Road junction and walked the half-mile up to the cabin. I did the cabin inspection first, the way I always do. Lock, door frame, roof, no signs of forced entry. Everything was fine. Then I walked around to the southeast side of the clearing and started down the slope. The terrain is yellow poplar and white oak at that elevation, with rhododendron in the wetter sections and ferns covering the ground between. The leaf duff in November is thick and slick, and you pay attention to your footing on a 15-degree slope. I had my GPS unit set to the approximate coordinates I had derived from the frame geometry, and I was watching the terrain as I moved toward them. I almost walked past it. The entrance was set into the base of a shallow depression in the slope, the kind of topographic irregularity that forms over decades when a mine portal settles and partially collapses, and the surrounding terrain slumps inward around it. From uphill, it looked like a shadow under a large root mass. From directly in front of it, once I was about 4 feet away, I could see the portal clearly, an opening roughly 3 feet tall by 4 feet wide, cut into the hillside, framed with timber. The frame was American chestnut. I recognized it from the gray-dark color and the exceptionally dense, tight grain that chestnut has even after a century of weathering. American chestnut was effectively eliminated from Appalachian forests by the chestnut blight that swept through from the early 1900s into the 1940s. By the time the blight reached its full extent, mature chestnut was gone from the landscape. Timber cut before the blight was used extensively in construction throughout Appalachian Kentucky, and old structures that predate the blight are identifiable in part by the chestnut lumber in their frames. The timber around this portal had been cut well before 1920. That put the adit, at a minimum age of 100 years. Above the portal, where the rock and soil of the hillside overhung the entrance, the overburden had been cut and partially stabilized with additional timber cribbing. The portal was still mostly intact. The opening narrowed slightly at the top by decades of slow settling, but functional. Vegetation had grown across and around the depression, which is why I had almost walked past it. Standing above it on the slope, looking downhill, the depression and portal were nearly invisible in the November leaf-off understory. I crouched at the entrance and clicked on my headlamp. The pipe was the first thing I saw. It ran along the left wall of the adit from somewhere in the interior toward the portal. A section of black steel stovepipe approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter, secured to the rock wall at intervals with wire ties. At the portal, the pipe angled upward at roughly 60 degrees and passed through the rock and soil of the portal arch, disappearing into the overburden. I followed it upward with my light. On the exterior of the portal face, at the upper left edge of the opening, the pipe entered the hill and was gone. I stepped back and looked at the surface of the slope above the portal. About 4 feet above and slightly to the left of where the pipe disappeared into the overburden, there was a small disturbance in the moss and leaf duff on the hillside surface, a slight compression with a small opening at its center. I cleared the moss with the back of my gloved hand. The end of the pipe was there, fitted with an angled elbow piece that directed the outlet to the southeast, pointing roughly downhill and away from the clearing where the patrol cabin sat. The elbow was positioned below the surface of the surrounding moss. If you were not looking for it, you would step over it without seeing it. It was a chimney, in the full sense of the word. A flue running from a firebox inside a structure, through the overburden of the hillside, to open air at the surface. Not stone, not brick, not anything built above the ground. Just steel pipe driven through 4 feet of soil and rock, doing the same job any chimney does. The smoke from that pipe would rise from that point in exactly the thin column I had captured in the 602 frame, and from the camera's position at the clearing edge it would appear to be coming from the ground itself. I had been standing on or near that slope for 10 years and I had not known the pipe was there. I ducked through the low opening and went into the adit. A drift mine adit is a horizontal tunnel driven into a hillside to follow a coal seam. This adit had been driven roughly east-northeast into the ridge, tracking what was visible as a thin seam of coal in the left wall, maybe 18 inches thick, running at a slight upward angle into the rock. The seam was high volatile bituminous coal, the dominant coal type across the eastern Kentucky-Pennsylvania-era seams, lower in sulfur content and heating value than the thicker, mid-volatile bituminous coals of the central Appalachian field. The tunnel was approximately 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, the walls and ceiling showing the marks of hand tools, picks, and possibly a small compressed air drill. 2-man operation, at most. The kind of operation a family or a small partnership would run. The adit went back about 45 feet before the ceiling dropped significantly, and a partial collapse had occurred. I could see the passage continuing beyond the collapse, but I did not proceed past the first 20 feet on that initial visit without a proper structural assessment. The first 20 feet formed a natural room where the adit had been widened slightly during excavation, probably to allow a small cart to turn. That room was where the living space was. On the right side of the adit, against the wall, there was a sleeping platform built of rough-sawn dimensional lumber laid across a frame of treated 2x4 stock. The platform was about 6.5 feet long and 3 feet wide, raised to approximately cot height off the packed earth floor. The platform was solidly constructed. The lumber was modern, pressure-treated at the base frame and bare wood at the sleeping surface. Someone had measured and cut this platform to fit the width of the adit and had constructed it with care, leveling it and securing it so that it did not shift. On the platform was a sleeping bag, the kind with a waterproof ripstop nylon outer shell and a downfill rated to below 0 temperatures, cinched closed at the top. Against the back wall, a wooden shelf system had been constructed from boards and wire brackets, driven into the rock with masonry anchors. On the shelves, a 1-liter stainless steel water bottle, a compact backcountry water filter of the kind rated for 5,000 gallons before filter replacement, 2 sealed packages of emergency ration bars, a small first aid kit in a zippered nylon case, a folded wool cap, and a pair of work gloves. Everything was organized, and in its place. The shelf was arranged the way someone arranges things when they plan to find them again without wasting time. Built into a recess on the left wall, near the junction of the widened room and the narrower passage beyond, was a metal wood stove insert, approximately 12 inches wide by 12 inches tall, with a hinged front door and a top exhaust port. The insert was fitted into a chiseled recess in the rock wall and secured with mortar around its perimeter. The stovepipe from the insert ran along the left wall to the portal, and then upward through the overburden to the elbow on the surface. The stovepipe joints were sealed with high-temperature silicone sealant. The installation was neat and appeared to have been done with some knowledge of what was required for adequate venting in an enclosed space. The firebox grate held a small amount of pale gray ash, cold, approximately a quarter cup spread across the grate. Small amount. The kind left by a hot, complete burn of a limited quantity of dry hardwood, the kind of fire you build for warmth and efficiency in a small space where you do not want to fill the air with smoke or waste fuel. Someone was burning very small, very controlled fires in a coal mine. The floor of the adit, packed earth and coal dust, was swept. I stood in the space for a few minutes with my headlamp on and looked at everything carefully. The ceiling above me was solid rock, the same shale and limestone of the ridge, with no visible cracking or spalling in the first 20 feet. The timber props that supported the ceiling at the junction of the entry room and the narrower passage beyond were old-growth chestnut, the same material as the portal frame, still solid under hand pressure. The adit had been carefully excavated and competently supported, and a century of undisturbed time had allowed everything to settle into a stable configuration. The ceiling above me was solid, and the floor was dry, the way a shallow horizontal adit in competent shale and limestone tends to be when it has been undisturbed long enough to finish settling. It was cold and stable and held its shape. The air quality was fine, which requires some explanation. Abandoned mine workings can accumulate methane from the surrounding rock and coal, carbon dioxide from biological activity, and in some cases, hydrogen sulfide from sulfur-bearing materials. Those hazards are real and have killed people who entered old mines without proper gas detection equipment. But the risk profile varies enormously depending on the mine's depth, the type of coal, the degree to which the seam has been exhausted, and critically, the ventilation characteristics of the mine. A shallow horizontal adit in a thin, fully exhausted bituminous seam, with an open portal at one end and a stovepipe at the other, ventilates naturally through the temperature differential between underground air and outside air, and through any wind moving across the portal opening. A seam that was fully worked out 100 years ago and has had that much time to off-gas is not accumulating significant methane in its accessible sections. What methane might have been present when the coal was active is long dispersed. The stovepipe provided an additional pathway for air exchange beyond the portal. None of that means an old mine is categorically safe to enter without assessment. I am a Forest Service ranger, not a mine safety inspector, and I stayed in the entry room and did not proceed into the collapsed and narrower sections beyond the first 20 feet. What I can say is that the air in those first 20 feet smelled of cold stone and coal dust and faintly of old wood ash, and I did not detect any of the odor signatures associated with methane or hydrogen sulfide. Someone had been burning small fires in this space and occupying it without apparent ill effect, which is consistent with the ventilation characteristics I have described, and also consistent with the fact that they were still coming back. The stovepipe installation told me something else about whoever had set it up. It was not a casual installation. Driving a 3/4-inch steel pipe through 4 feet of rock and soil, with an outlet positioned precisely below the moss line on the exterior slope, fitted with an elbow angled to direct smoke away from the obvious sight lines, sealed at the joints with high-temperature silicone, secured along the interior wall with wire ties at regular intervals. That installation required planning and the right materials, and at minimum a couple of hours of careful work. It required someone to think through the ventilation problem, solve it, and then solve a second problem, which was how to make the solution invisible from outside. That is not a casual decision. That is someone who has been thinking about this space and its utility for a long time. I put everything back where I had found it, as closely as I could match the original arrangement, and went back out through the portal. I sat on the slope above the portal for a while, looking at the section of hillside where the stovepipe outlet was. From the patrol cabin's camera position, This section of slope was a dark, irregular hillside. The pipe outlet under the moss was invisible. If you were not specifically looking for it after being told it was there, you would not find it by looking at the slope from the clearing. I thought about the 247 frame. The form at the slope edge, upright and still at 247, gone at 347. The smoke column at 502. Someone had been at the portal in the early morning hours of October 9th, had gone inside, had burned a small fire for approximately 3 hours, and had left before or around dawn. The camera had caught the transition, the person at the entrance before going in, and the smoke column while they were inside. I walked back up to the cabin and sat on the step for a while. Then I drove back to Whitley City. Back at the office, I pulled the land records for the parcel. The Forest Service had acquired the surface in 2 stages, in 1938 and 1942, from private landowners. The acquisition documents noted a farmhouse and outbuildings on a separate portion of the parcel, which had been demolished after acquisition, and a springhouse foundation that was still present as of a 1985 reconnaissance survey of historic features in the district. No mine feature was listed in the acquisition records for the section of the parcel that included the southeast slope above Pine Creek. The mineral rights were not part of the Forest Service acquisition. They had been severed from the surface rights in the 1920s, as was common in eastern Kentucky coal country, and sold separately to a succession of coal companies. The current mineral rights holder, as of the most recent record I could find in the county register, was a holding company based in Lexington with a name that indicated it was primarily a mineral rights aggregator. There had been no active mining on those rights in many decades, and the thin bituminous seam in the adit was not commercially viable at any modern scale. I called the Stearns Heritage Museum later that week and spoke with an archivist named Darla, who has been working with the museum's collection of Stearns Coal and Lumber Company records for about 15 years. I described the adit, its approximate location, its construction type, and the thin coal seam it tracked, and asked whether there were records of informal mining operations in that area outside the Stearns Company's main operations. Darla told me that the Stearns Company had operated large-scale coal extraction in the county, but that throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, individual families and small partnerships throughout McCreary County had worked thin surface seams, using exactly the kind of informal horizontal drift mining I was describing. Most of these operations had never been formally permitted or documented. They had simply worked the coal, used it for domestic heat, or sold it locally, and stopped when the seam gave out. She found one relevant record in the company files, a surface lease on a section adjacent to the current Forest Service road, 388 Corridor, dated 1914, issued to an individual named B. Combs, no first name recorded, for the purpose of removing coal for domestic use. The lease term was 3 years, with no renewal on file. 1914, if the adit dated to the lease, it was 110 years old. Before I drove back out to the hollow the following week, I stopped at the back of my truck and took out a camera I had purchased with my own money the previous year, a Tacticam Reveal X Pro, a 26-megapixel cellular trail camera that sends thumbnail images to an app on my phone when it triggers, and stores full-resolution files on its SD card for download. I had been using it on personal hunting land. I drove it out to the hollow and mounted it in a rhododendron thicket about 35 feet from the adit portal, aimed at the entrance, set to motion trigger with a 10-second video clip. I covered the housing with dark burlap and secured it in the thicket so that it was not visible from the portal. The cellular plan sends me a low-resolution thumbnail on my phone when the camera fires. 2 weeks later, on the evening of November 29th, my phone buzzed with the notification sound I had assigned to that camera. I was in the living room when it came through. I opened the app and looked at the thumbnail. The image showed the adit portal. In the portal opening, there was a figure, upper body inside the adit, lower body still outside, one hand on the timber frame of the portal. The thumbnail was small, and the resolution was low by design. I downloaded the full-resolution file to my laptop. In the full-resolution image, the figure was an adult at the portal with a large external frame backpack resting against the timber frame beside them. They were in the process of either entering or exiting, paused, with the upper body turned slightly, as if listening or checking the approach behind them. The Tacticam's no-glow infrared illuminated the area cleanly. The figure's face was turned enough away from the camera that I could not identify features, and at 35 feet in infrared, fine facial detail is limited regardless. What I could see clearly was the size and posture, broad-shouldered, tall enough to require ducking at the portal, moving with the ease of someone who knew the space and was not entering it for the first time. I looked at that image for a long time, then I set my laptop aside. There were 3 images from November 29th, the first at 9:14 p.m., the figure pausing at the portal. The second at 9:17 p.m., the portal empty and the pack visible leaning against the frame outside. The figure had gone inside and left the pack at the entrance. The third image came at 11:02 p.m., the figure re-emerging, settling the pack onto their back, turning south toward the lower hollow and moving out of frame. An hour and 45 minutes inside the adit. I went back through all the clips the Tacticam had generated since I mounted it in mid-November. 4 deer events, 3 of them at night, 1 at midday. A gray squirrel on November 22nd. 1 clip of wind moving the rhododendron heavily enough to trigger the motion sensor. Then nothing until November 29th. I thought about the November 29th timeline. 9:14 p.m. entry. Pack left outside during the stay. 11:02 p.m. departure with pack. The outside temperature at the nearest reporting station, the Somerset Pulaski County Regional Airport, about 40 miles to the northwest, had been 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of November 29th. 22 degrees. Whoever had been at that adit portal at 9:14 p.m. in 22-degree temperatures had been there by choice and with preparation. I called my colleague Dennis the next morning. Dennis is a wildlife biologist assigned to the Stearns District who has been with the Forest Service for 8 years. I told him I had evidence of unauthorized occupancy at a historic mine feature near the patrol cabin above Pine Creek and asked if he could come with me to look at it. I did not show him the Tacticam images yet. We drove out to the hollow on December 2nd. I showed Dennis the adit portal without narrating what it was. He crouched at the entrance and looked in and came back up and said, "Looks like somebody is living here." We both went inside. The sleeping bag was gone from the platform. The 2 plastic storage bins I had seen in November were still there, both closed, and one of them felt lighter than I remembered when I shifted it with my foot. The foam sleeping pad that had been under the platform was also gone. The wood stove insert was still in the wall, the stovepipe still connected and running to the portal and through the overburden to the surface. The headlamp that had been on the nail above the shelf was gone. The water filter was still on the shelf, along with the ration bars and the first aid kit, and the other items I had cataloged on my first visit. On the shelf, there was a new addition, a compact propane camp stove, the kind rated for use in tents and enclosed spaces, folded and stowed in its carry pouch. The firebox was cold. I held my palm near the insert for about 30 seconds, no heat. Dennis said what he should have said, which was that we needed to report this and consider sealing the portal. He had a point on both counts. Unauthorized occupancy of Forest Service land is a documented violation, and sealing known entry points is standard protocol for sites where the occupancy presents liability or safety concerns. Dennis was applying the protocol correctly, and I knew it while he was saying it. He also said, "You do not know who this is or what they are capable of. You have been out here alone checking this place without telling anyone." He had a point on that too. I told him I would handle the report. I did not say what I would do about the portal. On the drive back to Whitley City, Dennis asked me what I thought the person was. I said I thought the person was someone who had found a workable shelter in a coal mine on Forest Service land and was using it periodically, managing supplies carefully, and taking deliberate steps to stay undetected. Dennis said, "But why?" I said I did not know. He said, "Do you think they know you have cameras?" I said that, based on what I had seen in the footage and what I observed about the approach routing, I thought there was a reasonable chance they did. Dennis did not say anything for a while after that. I filed the unauthorized occupancy report the following week. I noted the adit's location and dimensions, the evidence of extended occupation including the Tacticam images from November 29th, and the fact that no individual had been identified, and no threat to any person or property had been documented. Under the recommendations field I wrote, "Flagged for abandoned mineland assessment. No immediate safety hazard identified. Portal condition stable. I did not recommend immediate closure. I did not put a lock or a timber barrier on the portal. I thought about that decision for about a month before I was fully settled on it. The practical argument against closure was straightforward. The portal could be unblocked by anyone with an hour and a pry bar. A lock on the frame would communicate to whoever was using the adit that they had been identified, and the most likely response to that communication was that they would find another space somewhere in the district or in the adjacent Big South Fork area, somewhere I had no cameras and no documentation, and they would continue doing whatever they were doing without my knowing anything about it. Sealing the portal would convert a documented and observed situation into an undocumented and unobserved one. That did not seem like an improvement. The less practical argument was harder to put into words, but it was also present in my thinking. The adit had been a mine for 110 years. Before that, it had been a hillside in a forest that Daniel Boone himself had passed through in the 1760s. The Forest Service had been managing the surface since 1942. In all of that time, the only documented occupancy event in the record was the 1955 newspaper item about a man found in a mine drift above Pine Creek, brought to town, given 2 nights of shelter, and then back in the forest within a week. The record did not say whether that man had used this adit specifically, but the geography was consistent with it. That was 70 years ago. Whatever was happening in this adit had a longer history than my decade in the district. Sealing it would end the record, not the history. I called Darla at the Stearns Heritage Museum again in January and asked her to look more closely at the B. Combs name from the 1914 lease. She called me back after about 2 weeks. She had found a McCreary County property record from 1922 for a man named Burl Combs, listed as a coal operator and subsistence farmer on land adjacent to what is now the Forest Service road corridor. A 1930 census entry gave his age as 53, which put his birth year at around 1877. A 1938 deed showed the land transferring to his son, Harlan Combs. The Forest Service acquisition record from 1942 showed the purchase of Harlan Combs's surface rights for $2.35 per acre, the standard Depression-era acquisition price. The record noted no structures on the portion of the parcel that included the southeast slope above the hollow. The mineral rights were not acquired. They had already been sold separately in the 1920s, the way mineral rights in eastern Kentucky coal country were routinely severed from surface rights during that period, and they passed through several holding companies before reaching their current owner. Darla also pulled something from a Whitley City newspaper archive that I had not asked for. A brief item from January of 1955, 2 paragraphs, describing a man found during a severe cold snap, living in what the reporter called a mine drift above Pine Creek in McCreary County. The McCreary County Sheriff had gone out after a report from a logging crew working the adjacent ridge. The man was found in reasonable health and described by the sheriff in the article as a local individual who preferred the arrangement. He was not named. The sheriff's comment in the article was that the man was doing no harm and the matter was not a county concern. 1955 was 70 years ago. I do not think the person currently using the adit is the same man who was found there in 1955. A person who was adult enough to be described as preferring the arrangement in 1955 would be well over 100 years old today. But the fact of the 1955 account told me something about this particular space and its history. Someone had determined that it was usable and had used it, and that knowledge had apparently persisted long enough to be available to whoever was using it now. I thought for a while about how that knowledge passes. The Combs family had worked the adit. Burl Combs, from 1914 to around 1917, when the lease lapsed. The land transferred to Harlan Combs and then to the Forest Service. If Harlan Combs or anyone from that family had told someone else about the adit before the acquisition, or if the adit had been known in the local community, that knowledge could have circulated in the informal way that knowledge about backcountry resources does in rural communities. Person to person, generation to generation, without any written record. I have no evidence for that chain. It is one possible explanation. The Tacticam continued generating images through winter. December. 2 events, both December 19th, entry and exit spanning about 90 minutes. January, 1 entry image. January 14th, No corresponding exit image in range of the camera, which suggested the exit route had shifted. February. No images from the entry camera. I checked the adit in person in late February and found the firebox ash fresh, less than a week old by the look of it. Someone had been inside since my last visit without triggering the Tacticam. That meant they had come and gone through an approach route outside the camera's field of view, or had identified the camera's position and moved around it. I noted this in a log I had started keeping in a dedicated notebook. Dates, images, observations, ash condition, any changes to the contents of the space. I set the Tacticam to a wider motion zone and repositioned it about 6 feet to the left to cover more of the approach from the north. In March, the Tacticam caught an entry image on March 14th. The figure at 9:08 p.m., carrying something large under their right arm, in addition to the external frame pack on their back. A bundle wrapped in dark material, the way you would wrap something in a tarp or a heavy canvas. No exit image from that night. The figure had left through a route the camera did not cover. I drove out the following week. The foam sleeping pad was back under the platform. The sleeping bag was a different one, heavier, with a dark green ripstop shell. The propane stove now had 2 additional fuel canisters on the shelf. A new item on the shelf beside the water filter, a compact solar charger panel, 6 inches by 4 inches, folded closed. A solar charger and a mine adit. The only light the adit received was the diffuse ambient light from the portal opening during daylight hours. The charger would need to be taken outside to function. Someone was managing power for something, possibly the headlamp, possibly a small radio or a phone. I added everything to the log and drove back to Whitley City. The formal abandoned mine land assessment report I had submitted in April worked its way through the district review process and came back with a determination that the adit had been added to the assessment queue. The district supervisor told me that the current backlog stood at about 30 features, and that new additions typically reached full assessment within 4 to 6 years. 4 to 6 years meant that the assessment might happen in 2028 or 2030. During that time, the adit would remain as it was, since no immediate safety hazard had been identified in my report. I understood what that meant in practice. I went back to managing the trail crew schedules for the coming season. Through spring and into summer, the visits continued. Looking at the Tacticam images and my log entries together, the pattern was consistent. Entry every 4 to 6 weeks, always after dark, always at night, with stays ranging from about 90 minutes to what appeared, based on the interval between entry and exit images when the camera caught both, to be overnight stays of 6 to 8 hours. The space was used, but not continuously occupied. It was being used as a waypoint, a resupply location, a place to sleep through bad weather or cold nights. April's visit, which I documented from the entry camera, and a corresponding change in the adit's contents, brought a change in what was being stored. The ration bars were gone from the shelf, replaced by a sealed vacuum pack of dried lentils and a mesh bag of dried mushrooms, the kind of longer-term food storage that someone managing a supply cache would rotate in and out. The first aid kit had been restocked. 2 of the wound dressings that had been in it previously were gone, replaced by fresh sealed packages. The water filter had a new cartridge installed. The old cartridge was in the trash, which in this context meant it was in a small cloth bag hanging from a wire hook above the bins, clearly being packed out. Everything was being managed. The space was being actively maintained. I added a 3rd camera in late May, a 2nd Tacticam reveal unit, positioned about 50 feet down the hollow to the south of the adit, aimed at the path the figure appeared to take when leaving in the southward direction. I mounted it in a stand of spice bush at about 5 feet off the ground, in a section of the hollow that was dense enough to conceal the unit from casual observation. In the first 2 weeks, the 3rd camera caught the figure twice on separate nights, moving south along the floor of the hollow at a steady pace with the external frame pack. Both times the figure was covering ground without a visible light source, moving through the hollow at close to midnight in darkness that would require either a light or an extremely thorough knowledge of the terrain to navigate at that pace. No light was visible in either image. In the June images, the figure was carrying the pack and something additional in their hands, what appeared to be a bundle or a sack. The way you carry something when your pack is already at capacity and you have acquired something additional at the resupply point. In the third week of June, the figure stopped appearing on the third camera's southward corridor. The entry camera showed them arriving from a different direction, from the north along the ridge rather than from the south along the hollow, and the southbound exit camera stopped generating images entirely. The figure had apparently assessed where camera 3 was covering and moved their routing around it. The northward approach required significantly more vertical gain than the hollow floor route, but passed through no area that any of my cameras covered. I noted in my log, subject has identified camera 3, adjusted approach and exit. That was the third routing change in as many months. The first time could have been coincidence. The third time was not. In July, I went out to the hollow and checked the adit and found a small change I had not expected. On the inside of the portal frame, at eye height on the right side of the opening, someone had driven a small nail and hung a length of dark cord that looped back and attached to a small object. A section of copper wire, bent into a hook and attached to a flat stone, the kind of rough indicator that tells you whether a door has been opened since you last set it. If the door was opened from outside, the motion would displace the cord and drop the stone. If someone had set that before their most recent departure, they would know on their return whether anyone had entered the adit in their absence. The stone was on the floor of the portal, displaced. They would know someone had been in. I photographed it, set the stone back on the hook, and drove back to Whitley City. I drove out in early August to do a check, and almost had a direct encounter. I had parked at Forest Service Road 388 and was walking the half-mile up to the cabin when I found fresh tracks in a section of the access road where a wet patch of clay held impressions well. Boot prints, adult-sized, heading toward the cabin area and then returning. The return impressions slightly deeper than the approach, which is consistent with carrying a load. The prints were no more than a few hours old. The clay was still holding moisture at the edges of the impressions. I had arrived in the middle of the day, which was not when I normally checked the cameras. I had changed my schedule that week because of a meeting that had shifted my afternoon, and I had decided to do the camera check on my way to the meeting rather than afterward. If I had come at my normal time, late afternoon, whoever had left those tracks would have been long gone. As it was, they had been at the cabin area, or the hollow, within the past few hours, and might still be in the vicinity. I stood in the road and looked at the tracks for a moment. Then I walked up to the cabin, checked the structure, checked the spy point card, and walked down to the hollow. The adit portal was closed the way it always was. I crouched at the entrance and listened. Nothing. I pushed the door open slowly and shone my headlamp inside. The space was empty. The sleeping bag on the platform, cinched closed. The storage bins in place. The propane stove on the shelf. Everything ordered. The firebox had fresh ash in it, pale gray, and when I held my palm near the insert body, I felt residual warmth in the metal. The fire had been out for maybe 2 or 3 hours. I stood there for a minute and then went back outside and walked back up to the cabin and got in my truck and drove to my meeting. I did not wait at the hollow. I thought about waiting for a long time during the drive, but in the end I decided that what I had was a log, 4 cameras, and a formal report in the assessment queue, and that whatever I was going to accomplish in this situation I was not going to accomplish by sitting in the rhododendron waiting. In September, I noticed the change in the stovepipe. I had photographed the pipe outlet on the sloped surface on my first November visit and on every subsequent field visit. The outlet elbow, when I had first found it, was directed to the southeast, pointing generally downhill and away from the patrol cabin's clearing and the camera position. I had noted in my first visit log that this orientation would direct smoke output toward the southeast vegetation rather than allowing it to rise openly above the mound, and that a camera in the cabin's position would have difficulty detecting the column if the fire was small and the outlet well positioned. On my September visit, I crouched at the outlet and compared it to my photograph from November. The elbow had been rotated approximately 20 degrees clockwise from its original position. The new orientation directed the outlet further to the southeast, away from both the cabin camera angle and, more significantly, the angle from which the tacticam at the portal entrance would have a line of sight to the outlet. If smoke from the outlet drifted in the original direction, it could, in theory, have been visible to the entry camera from a certain angle. In the new orientation, it would not be. The adjustment was subtle. It required knowing that the original orientation was being observed. It required understanding what direction the cameras were watching from. And it required care. The elbow fitting was tight and had been secured with pipe tape, and removing and resecuring it would have taken time and tools. I stood at the outlet and looked at the elbow and thought about the sequence of changes I had documented over the past year. The approach route shifting away from camera 3, the exit route changing after I repositioned the entry camera, the slope tracks indicating daytime access when my normal schedule would not have been present. Each change was specific and directional. Each change made the occupant harder to observe and harder to locate. I told Carol about it in October. We were at the kitchen table after dinner and I told her the whole thing from the beginning. She listened to all of it and then she asked, "Has anyone been hurt?" "No," she asked. "Has any property been damaged?" "No." The adit had been maintained. The firebox mortar had been repointed in a section where it had begun to crack. The stovepipe joints were in better condition than when I had first found them. She asked, "So what are you trying to do?" I told her I was trying to document the situation and understand who was involved and how long it had been going on. She said, "And then what?" I did not have a good answer. I have 4 cameras active in the hollow and on the approach routes now. I check them once a month, driving out to Forest Service Road 388 in whatever weather October or November or February is producing in McCreary County, walking the half-mile to the cabin, walking down the slope to the hollow, pulling the cards and downloading images to my laptop in the truck. The routine is the same. The images come in at a rate of about 2 to 4 events per month, depending on the season. And every time I review them, there has been a small adjustment. The approach route angles slightly differently. The exit timing varies. The stovepipe outlet sits in a slightly different orientation. Each adjustment is minor. The cumulative picture over 14 months of observation is of someone who has been refining their use of this space for a long time, and who has been watching me watch them with the same degree of attention I have been bringing to watching them. The abandoned mineland assessment queue has not moved meaningfully. The formal report is on file. The adit is on the district's list of features pending evaluation. In 4 to 6 years, an assessment crew will go out to the southeast slope above Pine Creek and measure the portal dimensions and check the structural integrity of the ceiling and note the presence of the wood stove insert and the sleeping platform and the Pine Creek presence shelf system with the water filter and the solar charger. They will write a report. The report will determine whether the feature requires immediate closure as a safety hazard or qualifies for documentation as a historic mine feature under the district's Cultural Resource Management Program. What the assessment will not determine is who has been using the adit, or for how long, or where they are between visits. I know what I know. I know the B. Combs lease from 1914. I know the 1955 newspaper item. I know the contents of the sleeping platform and the shelves in the firebox. I know the approach routes and exit routes from 14 months of camera images, and I know how each of those routes has changed. I know that the stovepipe outlet has been adjusted twice since I first found it, and that both adjustments moved it further from my cameras. I know that on August 7th, when I drove out at an unusual time of day, there were fresh boot tracks in the clay on the access road and warm ash in the firebox in the adit. Someone was there. Someone has been there for at least as long as I have been watching, and in all probability for much longer than that. The smoke column I saw in the 602 frame on October 9th came from a stovepipe outlet under a section of moss on the southeast slope above Pine Creek, in a drainage in the Stearns Ranger District of Daniel Boone National Forest in McCreary County, Kentucky, in a place I had walked past without knowing it was there for 10 years. I keep the cameras running. I keep the log. The portal is open. The firebox will have ash in it the next time I go out there, and the time after that. Whoever uses that adit above Pine Creek knows that hollow better than I do, and they have been knowing it for a long time. I am going back in November.